Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here at my next Avatar comic video. This one is going to be my speculation for Smoke and Shadow Part 3. Doing it a lot earlier this time than I did for Part 2, just because I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of what's going to happen in Part 3. Part 3 has a lot to resolve based on how Part 2 ended. So before we get into the speculation, the book is going to be out March 30th, 2016 in comic stores, and then it'll be out 13 days later in mass market release and stuff like that. So yeah, that's the release date, and as you can see throughout the video, you can see the cover. So the cover, I don't think gives a lot away, because the covers for Smoke and Shadow have been very misleading. Like, Aang is barely in Part 1, but he's on the cover. Part 2, it seems like there's this really big fight that happens, and Zuko and Mei fight back to back. That doesn't happen. This cover is just like, okay, Zuko's firebending, Aang's airbending, and the Kemurikage is there. This could happen given how Part 2 ends, and that we could open up with a proper fight like Aang and Zuko versus Azula, though based on what's happened before, there's no need to tag team Azula, in that I think either Aang or Zuko could take on Azula fairly handily on their own. So there's that. The cover doesn't really give a lot away. It's a nice looking cover, definitely. It's just like, the covers rarely, if ever, give you a real hint about what the book is about. But we do have a description. The description for this book is: children are disappearing in the Fire Nation capital. Avatar Aang and his friends are doing everything in their power to save them, but will it be enough? And worse, when Azula, the mad sister of Fire Lord Zuko, appears on the scene, Zuko locks down the city to catch her, igniting fear and riots in the streets. Will Zuko follow in his evil father's footsteps in order to save those he holds dear? So that's a very interesting description in terms of it gives us a hint about what's really going to happen. Okay, so Azula's appearance now causes fear and riots in the streets. Is this because they see her as the Kemurikage, or is it because they're going to reveal very early on to like everyone around that Azula is the Kemurikage? Like, is the whole idea that the Kemurikage are spirits, they are kidnapping the children, is that whole kind of fraud going to be instantly kind of shattered at the start of this book? That's what I suppose is kind of most important in terms of, I really think Azula being the big cliffhanger reveal at the end marks a shift in the story to the point where, it's no longer about what the new Ozai society is doing, Ukano's secret, who are the Kemurikage, and it marks a shift into, okay, Azula is ultimately the key person behind all of this in terms of a danger sense. Ukano seems to be somewhat of a planner behind the scenes. That can be resolved fairly easily enough. But Azula changes everything, and there's a lot of stuff set up around Azula in this book, in that there's the issue between her and Zuko, her and her mother, her and Mei and Ty Lee was even set up, and we know that's a pretty important plot point from ATLA. Her and Ki even could do something with. And then there's always, as I've been saying like throughout the entire Smoke and Shadow series, Ozai has been kind of conspicuous in his absence. Like, the only mention of him has really been New Ozai Society. But are they trying to get him back on the throne? Why haven't they tried to break him out? When's that going to come back up? And even with Ursa has some, I think, stuff that she probably needs to say to Ozai before she can really develop herself. But I'll get into that more later on. So there's a lot of stuff for Azula in terms of characters she probably needs to talk to. Ultimately, I think they're going to have a scene between Azula and Ursa. And how that happens, I'm not really sure. Like, ultimately, that's probably the real problem in terms of trying to speculate about Smoke and Shadow, in that ultimately the book is going to be a bunch of important character confrontations happening that we're not sure how exactly they're going to come to that, and we're not exactly sure how they're going to resolve it. Ursa obviously I assume will wake up, realize that Ki is not around, and suddenly think that she's been kidnapped by the Kemurikage. I think that's going to be something that happens. She's going to start freaking out, looking around for her. She's going to go outside and see potentially this confrontation on the rooftops. She's maybe going to overhear that it's Azula, and she's going to realize that she needs to do something here. Her two of her 3 children are fighting to the death, effectively, on the rooftops of their home nation. She potentially needs to step in here. She kind of understood from the end of the search that she was the kind of important thing in terms of Azula and her mental state. Azula ran off before they could have that confrontation in the search. It needs to happen here. But the plot that they seem to be setting up here is that Zuko is going to make some big decision related to Azula. I assume it's probably about whether to kind of kill her or not. That's gonna kind of tell him who he is. If he kills her, it's gonna make him look like Ozai, just like taking out whoever he needs. If he doesn't, it's gonna make him look like a bad leader, not protecting the nation. I don't really know how they're going to resolve this. I assume what's going to happen is that before Zuko can make his decision, or else he probably, I assume, would make his decision to like not do it, and like have that be resolved. There's no question about Zuko's decisions. And then Ursa arrives on the scene, and they have that moment, and the emotional stress of meeting Ursa again kind of just stops Azula in her tracks or something like that. How exactly they resolve it, I'm really not sure, because I don't think there's not enough time for a full Azula redemption. And I know a lot of people are looking for that, but I just don't see them being able to do that. I can see them potentially starting some sort of a road of like Azula redemption where she's not actively working against Zuko and stuff like that. And I think that involves Ursa and Azula and Ozai, I think, talking all together. Ursa making it clear that like Ozai like used her the whole time. That the reason she's like this, in some ways, is because of what Ursa, her relationship with Ursa, but ultimately it's that her relationship with her father isn't really that strong. Like there's not much of a bond there. Like he just used her and is using her once again to get Zuko off the throne. So something has to happen there. And then I think they very clearly set up something with, if not, I think they have to have a scene with Mai and Ty Lee talking to Azula, because as much as like Ursa's the key issue for Azula, the key thing that led to her mental downfall in the series like was that moment when Mai decided that she wasn't as afraid of Azula as she thought, and then Ty Lee joined up with Mai, and they kind of turned against her. That was the moment that kind of in a way broke Azula, and I think something has to happen there, and I'd like them to address their history as friends, that they all went to the same school, that at some point in their past, more so than just Azula threatening them to become her friends, that they were all friends, but something happened, and obviously they don't see her as a friend anymore because of the way she turned out. I'd like to see some sort of a resolution there, whether it be the two of them realizing that while they needed to do what they needed to do, that they did kind of hurt Azula or something like that, and try and make her understand what being a true friend actually is or something like that. The problem is that there's so many characters that Azula kind of needs to talk to. I don't know if they're going to get to them all in this book. And that's a real problem with speculating about this comic, is that so many confrontations. And I'm just talking about Azula, and Azula was only introduced at the end of part 2. And I haven't really started talking about the stuff that's been set up, really, in the past 2 books. So yeah, Azula is really going to change kind of what this series is in the final book. I think they'll probably end this. I'd like to see Key somewhat involved in whatever happens with Azula. I would like the two sisters to have a moment together, because they set up a sort of jealousy of Azula to Key in terms of like, oh, you have a good daughter now, am I not good enough type thing. So I would like to see a moment where Key maybe opens up to Azula and just shows Azula that like she she isn't some person that's trying to be different just to get Azula on her Ursa on her side. That's just who she is, and she cares about her new brother, and she would like to know who her new sister, her kind of older sister, is, and something like that to happen. It could be just a combination of all of these characters around Azula being open to something with her that causes her to kind of make some sort of a change. It won't be a full change, absolutely not, but in terms of a thing going on behind the scenes throughout these Avatar comics going forward, somewhat of a redemption, or her really, developing and kind of having a realization, I would like that to happen. I don't think they'll go down like she just remains evil, they have to kill her type route. That seems way too kind of tragic, harsh for them to even attempt to do. That said, we don't see Azula at all. We have no mention of her in Korra, so we don't really know where Azula eventually goes in the end. So I'm really kind of confused in that sense. So let's move away from Azula because there's so much mystery surrounding that. The main plot obviously is beyond that okay, the Kemurikage aren't actually like spirits in this case, though the Kemurikage did exist at some point, and we know we saw a spirit in the last one. But the Kemurikage that we're dealing with right now in the comics are people dressed up. One of them is Azula. Are the other two important? I'm not really sure. I don't think no obvious like female characters who at some point came into contact with Azula come to mind. So to me that says that they're probably just two female members who are reasonably skilled of the new Ozai Society. Now they do have to reveal what exactly the nature of the whole team up of Ukano and the Kemurikage is. Like, what's the origin of that? A lot of people question, rightfully so, I think, how Azula could possibly have planned this out herself given her mental situation. So is Ukano in any way in charge, or is it Azula, or is it the other two? How exactly did this come together? How did they know what the Kemurikage look like? Is Kalo in on the plan? Was he in the Dragon Bone Catacombs before, told the new Ozai Society what the Kemurikage looked like, and that's how this plan came into action? Or what? Part 1 and 2 seem to lead us to believe that the scene we see at the start of Part 1 is the first time Ukano meets the Kemurikage, and then after that they tell him what to do, and then there's this month time skip that happens where they steal Tom Tom, but he's in on it? Like, that's a kind of a weird thing where, like, I assume at some point during that month he kind of said, actually, I can't do anything now, so what are we going to do? And then maybe they brought him in on the plan, and that's when he became much more heavily involved in that. Part 2 seems to really hint that he is one of the people choosing the kids that they kidnap. So he seems really in on it. So, in regards to how they resolve that, I think it will come out very quickly that Ukano is in on the plan, and the kids will be saved fairly quickly. In that, it seems like Zuko and Aang are going to stay behind to deal with Azula. So I think Suki maybe will go off on her own, or maybe Suki and Ty Lee may go off and rescue the kids. But I think what they may end up doing is that May will find out what's going on the rooftops. Zuko will maybe tell her like what's going on, that Ukano is in on this, and she somehow finds out where he basically tells her the direction the other two ran off in. She catches up with them, and like maybe her and Kalo find the kids, and that may be when Kalo potentially reveals something or not. I'm not really sure. That's still kind of a mystery too, about like, are they going to reveal Kalo to be using May the whole time, or will they just have him be the kind of nice guy that we know he is? I really don't know on that count either. So there's a lot of things that need to be resolved. I think people want Zuko and May to find the kids at the same time. So maybe after the whole Azula issue is dealt with, they'll kind of search for that, and the two of them will find Tom Tom and Key together, and we'll maybe get a scene of Key and Tom Tom interacting, and that will, maybe those two talking about Mei and Zuko will bring them back together. But then I think there also has to be a scene between Mei and Ukano, where Mei realizes how much she's being used by Ukano, this whole kind of story arc, and kind of really put into perspective that, like, you were trying to, like, put me down this entire time, that I couldn't look after Tom Tom, but you were behind this the whole time. You were lying to our family. You were putting your desire to get Zuko off the throne ahead of everything else. I don't know how you can really heavily do any sort of redemption for Ukano and have it just be like, oh, family's back together, healed. I think he has to do something really big to prove that he really does care about his family and can put that ahead of everything else. But staging a kidnapping of your own son, whether he was in any way in on that plan himself, or it just happened and he kind of had to do the rest of the stuff, he is still working to, like, have kids kidnapped and not tell anyone about it. He's done a lot of wrong here, and I don't know really where they're going to go with this, because he seems, especially after part 2, pretty villainous, and so it's an interesting situation there. So there's definitely that needs to happen. Now, with regards to the romance triangle, there's a couple of ways they can go with this, in that I think everyone pretty much assumes, and I think it has to be the case, I don't see them breaking up this relationship. They will have to do Zuko and Mei get back together at some point. I hope it's covered in this book, because I'll be pretty annoyed if Kalo and Mei are still together at the end of this. I think it's just a completely unnecessary way to keep the two of them apart when it's so obvious that they're meant for each other. The book has been very clear so far about Mei still caring for Zuko, Zuko still caring for Mei. It's just that Kalo is kind of in the way of all of this happening. Now, they can go two roads with Kalo in terms of having him get out of the relationship with Mei. They can have some of the suspicions be true, in that he has all these criminal talents. He has still been working for the New Ozai Society the whole time, and has kind of been using Mei. Or he still cares about her, but has been using her the whole time, and that breaks them up. Or they can go the other road, and that, like, no, he sided with Mei, he cares for Mei, and it's completely true. Like, he likes her more than Mei likes him. He comes to realize that, and realize that her and Zuko are what has to happen. And they could do an interesting character arc with him, referencing part 1 and the whole, I wanted something to belong to, that's why I joined the New Ozai Society. I didn't really care for their ideals. Now I realize I want to belong to someone. You, Mei. Like that's basically what we get of him in part 1. I think they may do something where they have to address that, and that seems like a quite honest thing, but from a personal sense, that's a kind of a little bit unhealthy, that he has such kind of low self-worth or whatever, that he feels the need that he has to be belonging to something, someone, thing, and just, they could do something interesting where he realizes that he kind of has to, in a way, I suppose, find a way to belong to himself, just like have that self-worth, that he doesn't need anyone to kind of be who he is, and that's kind of lead him to believe that, like, I don't need this relationship to kind of make me be worthy or anything like that, that Zuko and Mei can get back together, I can be on my own, and just have him have that discovery as just a character on his own, because ultimately the thing holding him back as a character right now is that he's so involved in this romance that we don't know much about him as an individual. If they want to keep him in a romance, I think they've very well set up Ty Lee and Kalo as a relationship from part 1, in that she clearly likes him. She says that he has a really good aura about him, and it's clear that she does like him as well. So that will be an interesting way to go, and that they both have kind of similar character arcs, both understanding that, like, Ty Lee, she doesn't need to be 100% unique, and Kalo potentially that he doesn't need to belong to anyone or thing. So they could do that. What exactly will they say between Zuko and Mei to get them back together? I think they may use the fact that Zuko cares a lot for Tom Tom as a key point in that. That maybe there's a moment where she thinks that Zuko's gonna like ask her to get back together with him, but he kind of prioritizes Tom Tom over that, and it kind of clicks with her that like he really cares about my whole family, not just me and like the idea of her relationship. Like I'd like something like that to be important, and potentially have her meet Key for the first time and find her like really cute or something like that. That like Tom Tom and her become friends in the little time they get to know each other, and there's a really close kind of bond there in that sense, and the two gradually get back together. I'd like them to address the breakup with how it happened in The Promise, and that May broke up with Zuko, and the reason the breakup happened was because Zuko is kind of keeping some stuff from May, like he didn't tell her that he was going to see Ozai in The Promise, but just address the fact that Zuko was going through a lot at that point in The Promise, and he's resolved most of those issues at this point, I assume. Like he's got his mother back. He doesn't struggle as much with making decisions anymore. He seems to be very clear on who he is, and he's not his father, though they seem to be going for somewhat of a bringing that back in this book. How he handles Azula, I suppose, will be pretty telling, but I'm not really sure about that. But I'd like them to address that, but ultimately just make it clear that they care about each other, and I think very much so address what May said in part 2, the idea that I don't want to ever get hurt like that again, and like use the fact that, have them say something like that with May, the fact that she was around Zuko even allows herself to kind of feel that much is a big deal, and have like this idea that you don't need to be in a relationship where you constantly have to protect yourself. You don't have to be in this kind of almost one-sided relationship with Kalo to have that happen. Our relationship will have its ups and downs, but the fact is, you care enough to be hurt when there are issues between us, and that shows how much you care for me or whatever. So something along those lines, and have that bring them back together. But there's that. Ursa, they have a lot to do with Ursa as well. Obviously, her and Azula, I think, have to have a scene together. Her and Key have to have a scene together to resolve that. How they exactly do that, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe Key being involved in kind of whatever kind of gets Azula out of being a kind of villain in the story, or just being a kind of bringing the Azula issue to an end, the Azula kind of event in the streets to an end. Her potentially seeing her mother talk to Azula and maybe being a key in helping that could bring them closer together. But ultimately the key thing with Ursa is that they have to address the fact that she is terrified about being in the royal palace. Part of that is because every time she sees a picture of Ozai, she freaks out. And just in general, she feels so uncomfortable there and hasn't told anyone, and that's coming across very clearly to Key through the coldness in her hands. I don't know how they resolve this without her speaking to Ozai and getting out what she needs to say to him about how he treated her, how he treated the kids. I'm not really sure. Like, what's gonna just suddenly, without talking to him, make her not afraid of the palace anymore? Ikem, I think, probably needs a moment with her, show the new husband and wife and show what that relationship is like more. Maybe it's Azula that helps her. I don't really know. I almost like it where that Key realizes how afraid Ursa is and kind of realizes that she's been a little annoying about the whole, like, get away from me, mom, and stuff like that. Don't touch me, you're not my mother, and that sort of thing. And help her mother through the whole being scared issue. There's so much in this comic. I don't really know what they're going to focus on too much. The description I read out is quite vague about, like, oh, Zuko's going to have to make a decision, but, like, it's not going to be 70 pages focused on that decision. That decision has to happen very early on in the book, I think. in that, you know, they have to set up, I assume, the next series somewhat. And then, you know, will they address the real Kemurikage at all? Will the real Kemurikage come back into play? I don't think so, but I think they may potentially reveal more the closer connection between the Kemurikage and mothers and children, potentially as the only kind of lore aspect. But for the most part, it seems like it's going to focus on just dealing with Azula now, and then saving the children will be the kind of last bit of the main obvious plot that we've known for the first two parts to be resolved. How exactly all of this comes into play, like what Aang is going to really get up to through all this, I'm not entirely sure. Like, is he just going to be there to give advice to Zuko? Maybe he at some point goes off, like Zuko says, I can handle Azula alone. This is family business. There's no need for you to be here. You go off and try and find the kids. That could be a cool thing as well. But again, so many possibilities going into part 3. I think the most of any of these books at all, just because we don't know a lot about Azula going into this book. There's a lot of I suppose there's backstory to set up with her, where she went when she left the Forgetful Valley and stuff like that, how she came to be part of this Kemurikage plot and stuff like that. Just what her mental state is like, what the first thing she says, how she unveils herself under the mask is going to be fascinating. And, you know, there's also the potential. She was in the Forgetful Valley for like about a week or so. Did she go back to the Mother of Faces? Does Azula have a new face now? That's a very kind of wild theory, but they didn't unmask her at the end. Admittedly, I don't think they needed to with the lightning, but is there something going on there? Like, that would be an interesting way to do it, that like Azula forgets her memories to kind of try and fix things, but then why would she be actively involved in this plot to get Azula off the throne? Is Ukano manipulating Azula? I don't know. But it's fascinating going into the next book either way. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are going to this book. What do you think, out of all these possibilities of character interactions and stuff like that, what do you think they're actually going to do? I really can't piece together what I think they will absolutely focus on, because for me, they kind of need to touch on all of these character interactions at some point. But in the comments, let me know what you think is going to be the key aspects of this book, how you think part 3 is going to play out. Other than that, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.